Prime Minister, the return of Parliament, the 47th Parliament, the first sitting under your government, of the legislation and your priorities that you've outlined, do you expect the least contentious and therefore the first likely legislation to pass will be those aged care reforms?
Well, the aged care reforms are very important. Our legislation will introduce some 17 of the recommendations from the Aged Care Royal Commission. We've said that the Aged Care Royal Commission needs to be respected. The former government received the recommendations and then just sat on them. We want action to occur in aged care reform, and that is important legislation, but so too is the legislation on our emissions target, the legislation for 10 days paid domestic and family violence leave, the legislation to establish Jobs and Skills Australia. These are all a part of our position that we took to the election, that received the endorsement of the Australian people. We'll be introducing at least 18 pieces of legislation in our first week in Parliament, because we don't want to waste a day. Australia has had a decade of neglect and drift. We want to make sure we get on with the reforms that are necessary in order to advance Australia's interests, in order to create a better future for Australia.
You have said you want a better parliamentary culture, but one of the first things you did was to reduce the staffing for the crossbenches. Was that the best way to foster cooperation?
It was the best way to achieve some form of equity. I think that I was surprised that members of the crossbench had more staff than key personnel like the Shadow Treasurer, the Shadow Manager of Opposition Business, people in key portfolios. And the truth is that this was an arrangement that was put in place without proper notice or scrutiny. I believe that crossbenchers should receive additional support, which is why we've allocated one additional staff member on a personal staff level at a higher pay than electorate officers for members of the crossbench, and for some members, including the senators, will have more work. And in recognition of that, a range of crossbenchers who approached me and I had discussions with will all receive an additional 2 staff on top of their electorate officers. The idea that backbench, crossbench members should have more staff than frontbenchers in the government, who are allocated at least 2 in the form of assistant ministers, is simply not fair. And it is the case also that why should the member for Goldstein, for example, have double the staff of the seat next door to them in Higgins? That's not fair to the voters, and that is why I've introduced this change.
Were the Teal independents collateral damage in your effort to rein in the Greens as well?
No, this was a matter of fairness, and this had grown over a period of time. I myself, in terms of government staff, have taken a $1.5 million hit from the arrangements that were put in place by the former government. We have $1 trillion of debt. We need to make sure that there's equity in terms of the way that staff are allocated, but that also we don't see government expenditure continue to climb at a time when we've had cutbacks in permanent public service. We don't have enough people to deal with visas being distributed, but there aren't enough people in Centrelink. The only area of the public service that grew was political staff, and that is not an appropriate use of government resources.
You've been around the Parliament for a quarter of a century, a bit more than that. You've seen various commitments over the years to try and improve the standards and so on of the debate. Would you like your government to lead the way in improving the discourse?
I certainly would. And it starts with giving people respect. And I've been respectful to any member of Parliament who's sought to meet or to have a discussion by phone with me. I've done that. I want to see parliamentary processes operate properly. I want to see question time be able to occur without significant disruption that we've seen. I want Parliament to be able to legislate properly, and I want it to function much better. I want governments to be accountable as well, and that's the approach that I'll take to Parliament. Governments can set the agenda. It requires, of course, the cooperation of all members of Parliament, but I'm very confident that we can have a much better functioning Parliament. The most often used phrase during the last Parliament was that the member be no longer heard. Now, I'm not saying that won't ever be used if there's abuse of proper parliamentary processes occurring, but we need to be prepared to have debate and dialogue in the Parliament. That's the way that you get better outcomes.